There's a word that a lot of people use to describe the world depicted in Star Trek, and that word is utopian. To a big chunk of the Trek fandom, their main point of attachment is the fact that Star Trek shows us a vision of a better future. A future where humanity has solved its major social problems, embraced not only its own diversity, but the diversity of countless extraterrestrial species as well, and become an important part of an interstellar community where people of all kinds live and work together in equality and peace. The appeal of such a vision is obvious, especially when you compare it to the real world, and most especially when you compare it to the real world as it exists at this particular moment in history. But I think it's worth remembering that those utopian conditions don't extend to the entire world of Star Trek. Life on Earth and elsewhere in the United Federation of Planets seems pretty great for the most part, especially once you get to the era depicted in Star Trek The Next Generation and its immediate successors. But elsewhere in the galaxy, things can start to look pretty rough. Star Trek is celebrated by many for dramatizing a fantasy of what paradise might look like, but over the years, it's done arguably an even better job of showing us what the opposite of that does look like. Given the historical moment we are in and have been in for a while now, it feels like the right time to take a tour of some of the darker regions of this favorite fictional universe of ours and seek to answer the question, what does Star Trek actually tell us about fascism? The first part of this I want to examine is how Star Trek has, over the years, shown us examples of fascism or elements of fascism in various forms. Probably the most obvious example of fascism in Star Trek is Cardassia, the alien society introduced in the latter seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation and then explored with far greater depth throughout that show's spin-off, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Unlike most of the other alien civilizations I'm going to talk about, Cardassia is wholly and explicitly a fascist state. It bears all the hallmarks that would identify a fascist state as such in the real world. Cardassians are taught to value the state above everything else in their lives. This indoctrination is so effective that it even maintains a strong grip on people like Garrick, who has been exiled from Cardassia and eventually finds himself fighting against the regime he once served and still can't help but idealize. We get glimpses of conditions under the Cardassian regime throughout the run of Deep Space Nine, and we see that life is dominated by the government and the military. Every public action the government takes seems designed to reinforce subservience to the state, show trials to demonstrate to the people that defying the government is useless, and that all enemies of the regime will be found and punished. Enormous outdoor video screens that carry official speeches, forcing the public to pay attention. And though we never actually see one, we hear repeated references to enormous public monuments erected in honor of military and political leaders, serving as tangible reminders of the insurmountable dominance of the state. The formidable Cardassian military is not used merely for self-defense either. Cardassia is a nation of conquest, expanding territory, invading other worlds, capturing resources, and making war on its neighbors. And darkest of all, Cardassia enslaves the populations of conquered worlds, specifically, as we see in Deep Space Nine, the world of Bajor, where a decades-long military occupation is imposed and where millions of Bajarans are pressed into forced labor, trafficked into sexual servitude, made subjects of medical experiments, tortured, and murdered. Cardassians are Star Trek's allegorical representation of Nazi Germany, and the allegory is not subtle. In the later seasons of Deep Space Nine, Cardassia joins forces with the Dominion, an empire from another region of the galaxy looking to conquer the Federation, and the Dominion seems pretty fashy too, though we don't get many details regarding how their government operates. Then again, the details are not usually all that important. Whether the Dominion is specifically fascist isn't really the point. Whether Cardassia is specifically fascist isn't really the point either. I'm sure some viewers have gone over everything we learn about Cardassia and parsed it all very carefully and determined that actually Cardassia isn't fascist, but some other variety of totalitarianism. But since Star Trek is a work of fiction, and since Cardassia is imaginary, what matters the most to me is the overall impression it creates in the show, and that impression is fascist. Cardassia is the most complete picture of a fascist society that we get in Star Trek, but there are many other places that, at the very least, exhibit characteristics associated with fascism. For example, we don't see very much of life on Romulus, but from what we do see, it doesn't exactly seem like a cradle of democracy, does it? Like Cardassia, Romulus is isolationist. In fact, it seems to be even more of a closed society than Cardassia is. At various points during TNG and DS9, reliable information about internal happenings in the Romulan Empire is virtually non-existent. Secrecy and deceit are regarded as defining Romulan traits, and the regime is shown to be highly suspicious and hostile toward outsiders. And like the Cardassians, the leaders of Romulus are highly suspicious of their own people as well. Cardassia has an infamous intelligence department called the Obsidian Order, but before we learn about that, we learn about the Romulan version, the Tal Shiar. Both Cardassia and Romulus are obviously oppressive surveillance states, but the situation on Romulus seems to be even more suffocating than Cardassia, if that's even possible. We get a brief glimpse at what life on Romulus is like during TNG's unification, when Captain Picard and Data sneak onto the planet disguised as Romulans. That episode does an excellent job of conveying a sense of what it's like to live in a place where everybody watches what they say and do because they know they're being watched by people who are looking for an excuse. It's like the lives of others over there. We learn in the film Star Trek Nemesis that the Romulans also have an exploited and persecuted underclass, the Remans. There are other alien civilizations seen throughout the Trek franchise that may or may not be properly fascist, which show qualities that are at least fascistic. The Mirror Universe seems doomed to be ruled by a series of interstellar dictatorships. The Terran Empire, then the Klingon-Cardassian Alliance, then, according to an episode of Star Trek Prodigy, the Terran Empire again. The Borg take the fascist notion of subservience to the state to a whole new level, literally compelling individuals to act as drones in service to the collective. And in the most literal example of all, there's the world of Echoes, better known as the Nazi planet, from the classic Trek episode Patterns of Force, where the government is directly modeled on the German Third Reich, right down to the swastikas and the persecuted outgroup that is blamed for every problem. I'll return to Echoes a bit later, and I'm sure there are further examples I'm leaving out, but you get the general idea. The Star Trek universe may have some idyllic places where life is peaceful and free. However, it's also chock full of fascism. The question, to get back to the actual premise of the video, is what does Star Trek tell us through these various fictional depictions about fascism in the real world? What lessons about fascism and how it works, or more to the point, doesn't work, can we take from Star Trek and maybe even put to use in the extremely unlikely event that we find ourselves confronting a fascist threat in our own lives? Ha 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 ha! Lesson number 1. Fascism grows from a seed of fear and insecurity. In the classic TNG episode Chain of Command, Gul Madred takes a short break from torturing Captain Picard to argue with him about the virtues of the Cardassian government. I might say that being forced to argue with a fucking Nazi about anything is its own form of torture, but I guess it's better than having indescribably intense pain course through your entire body. Probably. Maybe. Picard observes that before the rise of the current regime, Cardassians were known to be a peaceful and spiritual people. Madred counters by pointing out that before the military took over, Cardassians suffered from mass starvation and disease, bodies lied unburied, life basically sucked. But since the military seized power, all of that has turned around. Cardassia has been rebuilt, its territory has expanded, its resources have increased, and the people are being fed. Picard can sit there and judge all he wants. Madred, who experienced desperate conditions himself growing up in the era before the current regime, says, "My daughter will never have to go hungry." And that seems to be the most important thing. Cardassia's eventual ally and later conqueror, the Dominion, seems to have a broadly similar backstory. In The Search, the third season premiere of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, it's revealed that Odo's long-lost people, the shape-shifting changelings, are the founders of the Dominion. When Odo asks why his people would want to impose tyranny across a vast region of the galaxy, the female changeling, who speaks for the group and is the de facto head of the Dominion, explains that long ago, changelings were rejected, hunted by solid species. They created the Dominion, became the founders, in order to control their former persecutors. What you control can't hurt you, the female changeling explains to Odo. Looked at a certain way, the story of a once downtrodden people rising to power over those who once mistreated them could cast the fascists in a sympathetic light, but I don't think that's the point. It's a cautionary tale. When conditions are bad, when people are suffering, when people feel powerless and afraid, that's when fascism can begin to rise. And to some people, in those circumstances, it can seem like an attractive alternative to what they're dealing with at the moment. Fascists promise a return to glory. Fascists promise strength and prosperity. Fascists promise law and order. Control. In Germany in the 1920s and 30s, the Nazi Party rose to power under conditions very similar to those in Cardassia as described by Gul Madred. Germany was a defeated nation following the First World War, in ruins economically. Hitler and the Nazis promised to remake Germany into a global power, and a lot of Germans went for it. The problem, aside from all the suffering and oppression the fascists themselves impose on the people, is that the promises of fascists are false. Lesson number 2. Fascism offers the illusion of control. This illusion functions in two ways. First, and most insidiously, it seeks to convince the people living under the fascist regime that they are the ones in control because they share in the control being exerted by the regime. In Star Trek, we see this exemplified by Cardassians who are loyal to the state, who take pride in it, who feel like Cardassia's victories are their victories. Fascists do this. They leverage love of country and loyalty to community in order to extract loyalty to them and to distract people from the fact that they are actually the ones being controlled. They are the ones being subjected to constant surveillance, and they are the ones who have been deprived of their liberty. Second, the illusion gives the impression that the regime is far more powerful than it actually is. A heavy-handed government can exert control over people, but only to a point. It can use violence and the threat of violence to compel or discourage certain behavior. It can use surveillance and informers to spread paranoia and chill speech, but it can't make people believe in things that they don't believe in. It can make them say they believe it, but it can't force them to actually believe it. There will always be people under a fascist regime who don't buy it. No matter how powerful, no matter how suffocating, no matter how long it has stood, there will always be those who see it for what it is, who work to undermine it, and who plot for its destruction. During Picard and Data's visit to Romulus in the episode Unification I mentioned earlier, they discover an underground movement of Romulans who are dissatisfied with the strict, isolationist status quo, and who seek peaceful reunification with their cousins, the Vulcans. On Deep Space Nine, we learn of the existence of a dissident movement on Cardassia, which sought to remove the military dictatorship and replace it with civilian authority. This movement consists of ordinary citizens like Professor Natima Lang and her students Raquelin and Hogue, who we meet in the episode Profit and Loss, as well as senior military officers like Legate Gamor, who we meet in the episode Second Skin, whose role in the movement is eventually revealed, forcing him to flee Cardassia and spend the rest of his life in exile. Professor Lang and her students are on the run from the Cardassian authorities as well. Being part of the resistance in a society like Cardassia is dangerous business. But the dissident movement does eventually manage to topple the Cardassian Central Command and restore civilian government following the events of the episode's Improbable Cause and The Die is Cast, during which the feared intelligence agency, the Obsidian Order, is destroyed. That victory is short-lived. Soon enough, Gul Dukat arranges for Cardassia to join the Dominion and installs himself as dictator of Cardassia, because of course he does, and Dukat subsequently dissolves all civilian authority. But perhaps there's a lesson within a lesson there. When fighting against fascism, progress is not always linear. Just because they depend on an illusion of control, that doesn't mean wresting political control from fascists is easy. Once they have it, they'll go to any lengths to keep it. One way they try to keep it is the subject of the next lesson. Fascism seeks out enemies and scapegoats. The example that leaps immediately to mind for most of us is probably the Bajorans, who are oppressed and brutalized by the Cardassian occupation of their planet, but I'm not sure that's the best example of how Star Trek teaches us this particular lesson. It does seem like the Cardassians use the Bajorans as scapegoats for the viciousness and, from their point of view, ultimate failure of the occupation. There's a lot of "you made us kill you" type of victim blaming from the likes of Gul Dukat whenever the subject of the occupation comes up. But we don't see evidence that the Cardassian regime scapegoated the Bajorans as a means to justify and maintain its authority over Cardassia itself. A better example of how Star Trek demonstrates fascism relying on enemies and scapegoats is the Nazi planet from classic Trek's Patterns of Force. The government of planet Ekos is modeled so closely on the Third Reich that it even has an analog of the Jewish people, the inhabitants of the nearby planet Zeon. Yeah, Zion, it's a bit on the nose, ain't it? Then again, that's clearly the point. The Ecosian Nazi regime targets the Zeons, declares them enemies, blames them for the problems afflicting Ecosian society, calls them a disease, and uses the hatred and fear of the Zeons, which it has manufactured, as a mandate to rule. Like the Jews under Nazi Germany, the Zeons are targeted by a campaign of systematic genocide. There's even an equivalent to the Nazi Final Solution, a plan to wipe out the Zeon homeworld called the Final Decision. The parallels are not subtle. I'm not done with the Nazi planet yet by a long shot, but I'm going to turn away from it temporarily to talk about another example, this one from Star Trek Enterprise. The two-parter that immediately precedes the series finale, consisting of the episodes Demon and Terra Prime, depicts a group of terrorists who attempt to force the government of Earth to expel all aliens from the solar system. Though the group, called Terra Prime, and its leader, John Paxton, are not explicitly fascist, the vicious xenophobia they exhibit is characteristic of fascism and can be found in real-life fascist movements, like the one surrounding this guy. Donald Trump, a fascist, began his political career by promoting the racist, xenophobic, and utterly false conspiracy theory that the then President of the United States, Barack Obama, was not a natural-born citizen of the U.S. and was therefore ineligible to hold his office. Then, several years later, Trump launched his own presidential campaign by describing Mexican immigrants as killers and rapists and promising to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border to protect vulnerable Americans from the supposedly violent invading Mexican hordes. Trump rode that wave of bigotry all the way to the presidency. Twice. Non-consecutively. And xenophobia and racism have remained core values of his administration, promising to protect real Americans from the threat supposedly posed by immigrants and refugees, by the trade policies of foreign countries, and from non-immigrant Americans who just sympathize with immigrants too much, I guess, is practically all Trump ever does. That, and complain when he thinks people are mean to him on TV, and post pics of his remodeled bathroom like an interior decorator trying to build an Instagram following, and insist he did nothing wrong whenever he's accused of crimes he absolutely committed. Yeah, that about covers it. So, Star Trek didn't quite predict Donald Trump. None of Star Trek's fascists are nearly so transparent, incompetent, or inarticulate. And also, according to one of the Star Trek comics published by Gold Key in the 1970s, the 45th president of the United States was a totally different person. This sharp-dressed dude here named Anton York, who I can tell just by looking at him would be infinitely preferable to what we got instead. But fascists like Trump will always invent enemies, which only they can defeat, and use the promise of victory over those enemies to fuel their rise to power. In fiction and in reality, fascists depend on framing life as a struggle of us versus them. Star Trek has always gotten that bit exactly right. Another bit that it's gotten right, and which is also proven true by our present moment here in the real world, fascist leaders are weak with thin skin and fragile egos. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the spokesmodel for fragile, thin-skinned fascists in the Star Trek franchise. There he is! The Duke! Years ago, I did a whole video centered on Gul Dukat, and I've talked about him quite a bit here and there beyond that. There's a lot to say about him. He's a splendid character, one of my favorites in all of Star Trek. For our purposes here, I want to focus on what a bottomless well of need he is. Once the commander of Cardassia's genocidal occupation of Bajor, Dukat craves admiration and validation as much as he craves power. He is the primary recurring antagonist on Deep Space Nine, and he spends most of the series trying to extract shows of respect from Captain Sisko, or affection from Major Kira, or agreement from pretty much anyone who isn't Cardassian that actually the occupation was good for Bajor, and he, Dukat, is a hero who did an amazing job. One of the sharpest bits of character writing in a series full of sharp character writing comes during the first conversation between Sisko and Dukat after Cardassia has joined the Dominion and Dukat has set himself up as the planet's autocratic ruler. Sisko tells Dukat, who had become more of an uneasy ally in the months leading up to his turn toward the Dominion, "I was wrong to think you changed in the last 5 years." And Dukat answers with, "Hey, one man's villain is another man's hero. You should see the monument they're erecting in my honor." Dukat is now the leader of Cardassia. He's basically the king of the planet. Whose idea do you think it was to immediately start building a monument to him? He says this to Sisko as though it proves something. "You think I'm such a bad guy? Well, guess what? They're building a monument to me right now." The fact that he ordered the building of this monument himself isn't relevant to Dukat. He doesn't see it as the act of a pathetic, insubstantial man. All that matters is that the monument will exist. He'll be able to point it out to others and say, "See that? That's for me." People like Dukat yearn for power for all sorts of reasons. Yes, they're narcissists who believe, foolishly, that they can do a better job running things than anyone else, that they are smarter and see things others don't. Yes, they want to wield their power to enrich themselves and take revenge on their enemies and settle personal business, but a big part of it is also that they want the prestige that comes with power. They crave respect, and they don't want to earn that respect. They want people to have no choice but to respect them. For Dukat, a big part of that respect also consists of people affirming that he's done nothing wrong. His preoccupation with winning over Kira has a lot to do with this. Sure, it's also because Dukat is a gross old lech who wants Kira because she's a beautiful woman, and as we eventually find out, he also slept with Kira's mother back in the day, so he wants to complete the set. I said he was a gross old lech, don't get mad at me. But I think the main thing Dukat wants from Kira is not absolution exactly, because he doesn't think he's committed any sins that he needs to be absolved of. He wants, well, I already said it, didn't I? Affirming. He wants affirmation. He wants one of the people he has wronged to tell him he has nothing to apologize for. Fascists are big on having nothing to apologize for. I know because they say it a lot. How often has Trump literally spoken the sentence, "I have done nothing wrong"? And when he does that, when any of them do that, they project how weak and fragile they truly are. Their innocence is not self-evident, nor is their strength, their intelligence, their toughness, their competence, their popularity, or their right to be the ones in charge. That's why they have to insist upon it. Another thing fascists like to insist upon is that they're doing what they do for the good of the people, that their policies are beneficial. They never actually mean that, but what if they did? What if someone took the reins of an authoritarian government and, instead of using the power to persecute and murder or enrich the ruling class, they used it for the good of the people? Next lesson. There is no benevolent form of fascism. Let's return once again to Echos, the Nazi planet from Patterns of Force. A natural question to ask might be, how'd there get to be a Nazi planet? The answer is, a human historian named John Gill came to Echos and founded a new government patterned after the Third Reich. Gill's big idea was to try to do Nazism just without, all the bad stuff. No persecution, no genocide, just, the good parts of Nazism. The point of the episode is Gill was a huge dumbass to even believe this was possible. Though unforgivably naive and fucking clueless, he may have been well-intentioned, but his Nazi project naturally attracted people who did not share those good intentions. People like Melicon, who drugged Gill and propped him up as a powerless figurehead, then took over and got to work murdering Zeons. Gill, with help from Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, tries to redeem himself and succeeds at stopping Melicon from carrying out the final decision, but he is fatally shot. As he lays dying in Kirk's arms, Gill says, "I was wrong. Even historians fail to learn from history. They repeat the same mistakes." And just in case it's not clear what those mistakes are, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy state it outright once they return to the Enterprise in their end-of-episode banter. The problem with the Nazis wasn't just that their leaders were evil, psychotic men, Kirk says. McCoy jumps in, adding, "Any man who holds that much power, even with the best intentions, just can't resist the urge to play God." There's a primitive desire that fascists appeal to that honestly is understandable. When you look at the world and all its problems and all its complexities, and you consider how difficult people are to govern, how getting things done, even urgently necessary things, can so often seem impossible, the desire to just have someone come in and take charge makes a simple kind of sense. We just need a strong leader to fix things. The problem is, that cannot be done with good intentions, because the wish itself is a bad intention. Humanity is not an unruly child in need of a stern parent. The problems we face are daunting, but we need to solve them together, with consideration for one another. Dictators and demagogues are not the answer. The most enlightened despot who ever ruled was still a despot. Like all the supposedly impressive stuff about fascist leaders, the supposedly beneficial qualities of fascism are nothing but smoke and mirrors. Star Trek shows us how that superficiality is to be found throughout fascist movements and governments. Next lesson. Fascism is inherently performative and disingenuous. To be clear, I'm not saying that fascism doesn't cause real, tangible harm. The wars fascists start, the persecution of marginalized people, the curtailing of civil rights, the gaslighting and rewriting of history, none of that is performative. I'm talking about the image that fascists project to the populace, the story they tell about who they are, what they stand for, and what they want. Pretty much any authoritarian figure ever seen in Star Trek demonstrates this. Gul Dukat frames his efforts as commander of the occupation and later as leader of Cardassia in high-minded, principled terms. He's acting for the good of Cardassia. He wants to restore to Cardassia everything it has lost. He wants to create a glorious future for his world and its children. But the truth is, it's all about him. The Cardassian state, before Dukat takes over, is shown to be very much the same. There's a lot of talk from Cardassians about the superiority of their culture and their way of life, but most officers we meet from that regime don't appear to be the least bit interested in any of that. All they care about is covering their own asses and advancing in their careers. The founders, represented by the female changeling, talk about bringing order to the galaxy, but we know they're really motivated by fear. Their subordinate species, the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar, have both been genetically programmed to spout the company line about how glorious the Dominion is and how infallible the founders are. Can there be a more direct statement of the hollowness of fascism than that in the Star Trek Enterprise two-parter, Stormfront, the Nazis, the actual Nazis? Well, Star Trek's fictional version of the actual Nazis even set aside their commitment to racial purity, which is arguably the organizing principle of their whole deal, in order to team up with the Nakul, a group of aliens who have traveled back in time to 1940s Earth as part of the temporal Cold War. Sure, you might say those aren't the real Nazis, they're just imaginary Star Trek Nazis, but do any of you find it implausible that Hitler would abandon his devotion to white supremacy in order to form an alliance with powerful extraterrestrials that he expects will help him win the war? Aliens from the future with advanced technology show up in Berlin in 1944 and say, if you team up with us, you can conquer the United States. And you really think Hitler would be like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. This is an Aryans-only deal we've got going here. I appreciate the offer, but we're trying to prove a point. I don't suppose so. Even the Borg try to put some bullshit over on those they want to conscript into their ranks. On TNG, in part 2 of The Best of Both Worlds, Locutus tells the crew of the Enterprise that all the Borg want to do is raise the quality of life for the people they assimilate. In the movie Star Trek First Contact, the Borg Queen tells Data that the Borg are all about attaining perfection. In reality, the motivation of the Borg is far less elevated than that. The Borg are driven by self-preservation. They're an ever-expanding, ever-consuming colony of insects. They're not bringing enlightenment and improvement to the galaxy. They need to grow to survive. Star Trek also shows us that when superficially democratic institutions exist in fascist societies, those institutions are strictly performative as well. The Cardassian justice system is nothing of the kind. It gives the appearance of a trial, but the prisoner's guilt and punishment are determined before the proceedings even begin. As I said earlier, this is done to reinforce the supremacy of the state, but it's also done to make the people think they're freer than they actually are. Things aren't that bad. We still have courts and trials, after all. And it shows us that the efficiency of fascist states is a lie as well. It's practically become a cliche that despite everything else he did, at least Hitler made the trains run on time. Except he didn't. The government of Nazi Germany was woefully inept and inefficient, a far cry from the image of the well-oiled machine it projected to the rest of the world. Star Trek reflects this through the glimpses we see of the Cardassian government, various agencies having no idea what each other is doing, as seen in the episode Defiant from the show's 3rd season, in which Gul Dukat learns of the existence of a fleet of starships belonging to the Obsidian Order that he didn't know was there. There's also the Terran Empire in the Mirror Universe, which is so wasteful and so preoccupied with subduing its subjects through violence that Mirror Spock predicts, correctly, we eventually find out, that its collapse is inevitable. Oh hey, that's our final lesson. The collapse of fascism is inevitable. I've made a similar point previously in a recent video in the series, so I don't want to belabor it too much here, but yeah, when you're living under the shadow of a fascist regime or a regime populated by fascists who are moving as fast as they can to impose fascism, that darkness can feel permanent. But history shows us that it's not. Star Trek shows us various ways in which the fall of fascism can happen. One way that we've seen over and over again is that fascists as a group tend to devour themselves. That constant need to identify and attack new enemies that I talked about earlier leads them to turn on each other. The slightest ideological difference, the mildest personal disagreement, can cause someone previously loyal to the regime to be cast out or to turn against it on their own. The ongoing pattern of internal murder and betrayal we see in the Mirror Universe is one of the main factors that makes the Terran Empire so unstable that Mirror Spock can confidently predict its downfall. On Ekos, the Nazi planet, Melikon takes control of the government by betraying John Gill, his Führer, when he decides that Gill isn't brutal enough. And in the most vividly realized example, when prospects for winning their war with the Federation dim, the founders turn on their Cardassian allies and lay waste to the planet, leaving cities in ruins and millions of Cardassians dead. This final act of betrayal by the Dominion is provoked by the actions of a liberation movement within Cardassia led by Damar that seeks to drive the Founders off of their world. The activities of the liberation movement are what ultimately allow the Federation and its allies to turn the tide of the war to their advantage. So the Founders take over Cardassia, Cardassians get sick of living under Dominion rule and revolt, the revolt eventually dooms the Dominion's war effort, and the Dominion retaliates by committing genocide against the Cardassian population. The terrible cost of resisting tyranny and the necessity of that resistance have never been more clear, and the depiction of fascists eating their own has never been more blatant or more devastating in Star Trek. Unfortunately, the reason fascism doesn't last forever is the same reason democracy doesn't either. It's a product of human beings, and human beings are flawed and fragile and forgetful. Fascism and other forms of authoritarianism are allowed to take hold to begin with because we forget that our diversity is our strength, and that anyone who seeks to use our differences to divide us and turn us against each other is an enemy of the people, not a leader. We know this. We see this. We've seen it over and over again throughout human history. The thing is, inevitably, we get too comfortable, or we get too desperate in our discomfort, and we forget. We lose the lesson. But given enough time and enough painful reminders, we always seem to find it again eventually. As long as humanity is here, there's hope for it. Of all the things Star Trek has to tell us, that might be the most important. Maybe one of these days we'll learn our lessons well enough that we don't need to be refreshed quite so frequently or so painfully. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Brad Trusso, thanks Brad. Alessandro Migliaccio, thanks Alessandro. Colin Hay, thanks Colin. Brian and Brian, what is Brian? Thanks Brian. Electra Abundance, thanks Electra. Jack Rowan, thanks Jack. The Big H, thanks Big H. Takale Xanador Kilile, thanks Takale. Cyrano Johnson, thanks Cyrano. Eric Branser, thanks Eric. A Big Fat Jerk, thanks A Big Fat Jerk. Robert Kukla, thanks Robert. And now the new channel members. They are Jabba the Pizza Hut, thanks Jabba. Flatline 1914, thanks Flatline 1914. Chip Bush, thanks Chip. CS, thanks CS. Cats Meow, thanks Cats Meow. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects. The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's regulation Trek Actually topic. It'll be December, and you know what that means. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, but not on Star Trek, because Gene Roddenberry envisioned an idyllic future where humans no longer celebrated holidays. There's not much overtly Christmassy content in Star Trek, but there is some sprinkled here and there. In fact, there's enough that I think it's worth making a video about. And I hope I'm right, because the topic of next month's Trek Actually video, as voted by my patrons and channel members, is: does Star Trek actually have any Christmas episodes? We'll see if Santa leaves me a good script under the tree. Only the script will have to be done before Christmas. And I write the scripts, so what am I even talking about? Doesn't matter. That's next month. I'll see you back then and a bunch of times before then. So until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching and take care, everybody.